Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans and you're watching the John Cedars channel from the bunker, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to part 2 of the governing body Who's Who 2020. To assist me in going through the remaining members of the governing body not discussed in our previous episode, I welcome back Phil, otherwise known as Blue Envelope, and Jay the comedian. Welcome, guys.
Hey everybody, how y'all doing? Don't say my name too loud. I'm trying to be inconspicuous.
You do seem to be in incognito phase there. But thanks to both of you for joining me, albeit, again, you're kind of a captive audience because everyone's in lockdown at the moment. But I hope you're both doing well through the pandemic.
So far, so good. I haven't done anything too bad. Got some dog food. Apparently, now everybody is a hero. And that's good. That's good. Like all these essential workers and stuff like that. It's been fun, and it's been a little bit tough, like just moving around and getting around outside because everybody got masks on. And I live in a neighborhood where masked people usually rob you. So it's an adjustment, but I'm making it, man. I'm making it.
You're making it through. Fantastic. So in our last episode, we discussed, let me see, my mind's just immediately gone blank. We did Herd, didn't we? We did Kenneth Cook, that's right. Stephen Lett. Who am I missing out?
Who's the guy who did the Royal Commission?
Jeffrey Jackson.
Jeffrey Jackson.
Done.
Gotcha.
Jay to the rescue, as my mind completely turned to mush. So for this episode, you see, I'm all thinking about this episode. I'm not thinking about the last episode, but it's important to name, for the sake of completeness, who we're not doing. If you are interested in knowing more about Samuel Hurd, Stephen Lett, Jeffrey Jackson, and Kenneth Cook, go back and watch part 1. But in this episode, we will be discussing Gerrit Lösch. We will be discussing Anthony Morris. Quite a bit to say on that chap. Mark Sanderson and David Splane. And again, I will be putting time markers in the description so that if you do want to jump straight to the governing body member of your choice, you will be able to just click on the timestamp and warp to that location in the video. We begin with Gerrit Lösch, and I'm going to be taking us through this. And again, we're going to be alternating myself and Phil. Phil is kind of, he wouldn't call himself an expert, but he sort of is our resident expert on the governing body members. Gerrit Lösch was born in 1941. I'm estimating, and that would make him age 79 in 2020 when we're doing this video. Again, if you're watching this in the future, well done for surviving. He speaks German, English, Romanian, and Italian. We know quite a lot about Gerrit Lösch because he's one of the 2 governing body members we're going to be discussing today who have their life stories published. His father was born in 1899 in Graz, Austria. In 1939, his father was conscripted into the German army. 2 years later, in 1941, Gerrit was born in the middle of the Second World War. In 1943, his father was killed in Russia. Now, I was doing some digging on this, Phil, and this is entirely speculation. I don't know what your thoughts are. But for me, it's interesting that he was killed in 1943 because 1943, February of that year, was the conclusion of the Battle of Stalingrad. So it would be interesting to know exactly where in Russia Gerrit Lösch's father died or during which campaign. Because if it was Stalingrad, that was a pretty bad way to go. I mean, there's no good way to die, I'm sure, as a soldier. But I was recently watching a documentary series on World War II, and there was a whole episode on Stalingrad. And the Germans were really they were kind of toyed with towards the end of that campaign by the Soviets and starved, and conditions among the German troops were appalling. So it would be interesting to know whether those were the circumstances in which Gerrit Lösch's father met his fate. Pure speculation, I know, but worth mentioning.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And that's what I was thinking. Like, on one hand, you could technically say his father was a Nazi, but so many of those guys were just, conscripted into the army that as possible he hated his role.
Yeah, it could have just been the Wehrmacht. It could have just been the German army. I suppose the SS were the real... well, I suppose they were all bad guys, weren't they? They were all fighting for an evil regime, but the Wehrmacht were arguably not as reprehensible, you might say, as the SS. So
I seen a documentary on D-Day, and they were talking about the Nazi soldiers, and they were saying that there were certain people who were technically Nazi soldiers, but they had to be like at gunpoint, because if they weren't, they and their family would be destroyed. You know what I mean? So it was even one part in the movie. They got a lot of praise in Saving Private Ryan, where these two soldiers were trying to say, we're here against our will. We're not really Nazis. And the Americans, I guess, they couldn't understand them, so they ended up just shooting them and killing them. And it was just like, that part of the movie had a lot of significance. It stood out to everybody about just the brutality of war, but it was even more because they were just saying that even if you were a Nazi soldier, technically they were fighting against people who were fighting for their freedom, So it's very interesting, because he once again, like you said, it's very possible he wasn't even a Nazi soldier.
Well, the testimonial article does say that his father was conscripted, so it wasn't like he, signed up to fight. I guess I'd just like to know more. And it's a shame that we don't know quite enough. But in any case, his father was killed in 1943, fighting in Russia. After the war, in 1948, I should just mention as well that Gerrit says that he never knew his father, and he makes a few comments about how that was one of the appealing things about becoming a Jehovah's Witness, that he had an eternal father who could never die. So he says words to that effect in his testimonial. After the war in 1948, Gerrit joins the Boy Scouts. He would have been age 7. He makes a few comments about attending international jamborees. Do you remember how I mentioned in our last episode, every now and then, little bits of information are kind of smuggled into the story that aren't really significant, but just seem to be included to make it sound more interesting than it really is. So,
hey, by the way, I just happen to be a great person. It's not important. I just want to drop that in, let y'all know that I'm amazing.
I got all my certificates. So he mentions going to some jamborees, these international gatherings of Boy Scouts. And he mentions attending one at Sutton Park near Birmingham in England in 1957. About 750,000 people visited us at the jamboree, including Queen Elizabeth of England.
Oh, my! Wow! She made time for them in their jamboree.
I was at an event that was also attended by the Queen. Yeah, it's okay, fair enough.
We were breathing the same air.
Yeah, we were in the same part of the country. 1958, he is witness to, by this time he's working at the Grand Hotel Wiesler in Graz, and he is serving as an apprentice. So it seems that at some point during his childhood, it's been decided that he should get involved in tourism, specifically in hotel work. And one of his earliest jobs is working at the Grand Hotel Wiesler in Graz. And his work colleague, called Rudolf or Rudy, I'm going to mispronounce this, Schickerl witnesses to him. And they start having these conversations, and Gerrit Lösch isn't persuaded straight away, but nevertheless, they have these Bible conversations together. I actually looked up the Grand Hotel Wiesler on booking.com. This video is not paid for by booking.com. And it's still operating as a hotel. You can stay there. Room prices start at $105 per night, so quite reasonable.
Is there like a special price for the quarantine? Is there like a quarantine rate right now?
I don't think you can probably stay there right at this minute, but once you can start booking rooms, I believe I'm led to understand that those are the prices. So if you want to carry out maybe a little pilgrimage to where it all began for a member of the faithful slave, you can stay at the Grand Hotel Wiesler. I should point out that this video is not sponsored in any way by the Grand Hotel Wiesler.
They can work that into the next international convention in Austria.
Indeed. That would be the premier way of doing a pilgrimage, wouldn't it, if he was doing an international convention at the same time. He starts he calls it further education in hotel management, following apparently this conversation, and relocates from Graz to Bad Hofgestein, which is in the Alps. By the way, I've driven through this part of Austria a few times, and it's absolutely stunning scenery. So as I was reading his story, I was imagining, these little villages nestled in the Alps. It's a beautiful part of the world. And he would occasionally work at the Grand Hotel in Bad Hofgestein. So this is where it gets a little bit creepy. And we've talked on this channel a few times about the very reckless approach that Jehovah's Witnesses take to data privacy, which is ironic considering that in the recent video slamming apostates, they claim that apostates are interested in harvesting people's personal data to use for nefarious purposes. And what's interesting is if you go and read Gerrit Lösch's story, it says, Rudy had sent my new address to the branch office in Vienna, Rudy, his work colleague, and the branch in turn, forwarded it to two missionary sisters, Ilse Unterdorfer and Elfriede Löhr. One day, the receptionist at the hotel called me and said that two ladies were outside in a car and that they wanted to speak to me. They tracked him down at his place of work.
Oh, my God.
Even though he'd never met them before.
And that's something a radioactive apostate hacker would never do.
Apparently, that's exactly what apostates would do. Apparently, we're harvesting people's data to use for all sorts of nefarious purposes. But then you have this story of a member of the quote-unquote faithful slave who's describing personal data being passed around on him and him being essentially stalked at his place of employment. It's astonishing, really, when you think about it.
So not only was this person's data taken, transferred, but it was also used.
Yeah.
He says, radioactive apostates got to catch up. We're not doing as good of a job as the organization.
He says, I was puzzled because I knew nothing about them. But I went out to see who they were. Later, I learned that they had served as witness couriers in Nazi Germany when their work was banned prior to World War II. Even before the war started, they had been captured by the German secret police, the Gestapo, and sent to the Lichtenberg concentration camp. Wouldn't it have been a twist if his dad had been working for the Gestapo? And anyway, then during the war, I'm not saying that happened, by the way. Then during the war, they were transferred to the camp in Ravensbrück near Berlin. So he was basically, you could say, fully recruited into the organization by some Jehovah's Witness survivors of the concentration camps. So he begins studying with Ilse and Elfriede in October 1958. In 1960, he concludes his hotel schooling and returns to his hometown to try to recruit his relatives. He says, even until now, not one of them has come into the truth, but some are showing a measure of interest. This was in 2014, so I don't know whether that's changed in the years since.
Some people need to learn the difference between showing interest and being polite. You know what I mean? Like, if
you imagine that that's what's happening. Yeah, it's like,
if
yeah,
you've been
Gerrit.
doing it that long and you still haven't gotten them, it's no longer interest. It's just people being, oh yes, that is nice what you're talking about. They're not joining. They're being polite.
You imagine them saying, yeah, Gerrit, we know you're going to heaven one day to rule as a king and priest with Jesus. Of course you are. We totally believe you. And Gerrit's like, they believe me. I knew they believed me. They're showing a measure of interest. So 1961, November 1st, he enters full-time service as a pioneer after, there's a very interesting part where he describes conversations with his employer at the restaurant hotel where he was working, and he starts off working 72 hours a week, and he manages in successive conversations to get his boss to reduce his hours right down to, I think, 36 hours a week from 72, and he's still getting paid the same. So another little story that seems to be included to show how impressed his employers were with him. March 1st. So,
like, was he running the entire business himself?
Goodness knows what he was doing to be that valuable to the boss. Yeah,
literally working double the amount anybody else would work to not only dropping but dropping under and still getting the same paycheck.
He was making sure those guests had the time of their lives, it must be said. So he starts pioneering November 1st, 1961. And at that time, he says the hour requirement was 100 hours per month. I remember when I started pioneering in 1998, I just started when it was 90. And then I think 4 months later, they dropped it down to 70. So I remember 90 being fairly grueling. I can imagine 100 being pretty bad. 1962, March 1st, I'm guessing. It was 4 months later in any case. He's appointed as a special pioneer and as the congregation servant. We must remember that in the 1960s, they didn't have the elder arrangement. They had congregation servants. So you went from elders in Russell's day to Rutherford, who couldn't stand elders, saying, no, I'm going to have a congregation servant who reports directly to Watchtower. And then they flip-flopped back to the elder arrangement in the 1970s. So it seems that Gerrit Lösch was one of these congregation servants for a period in a small congregation in the province of Carinthia, in the town of Spital an der Drau. And as a special pioneer, he was doing 150 hours per month. I think it's now 120.
Jesus, 150 hours out of field service a month?
Yeah.
If I had to party for 150 hours a month, I would die.
That's a lot of coffee breaks, isn't it? Let's be honest.
Coffee break.
So 1963 to 1976, he is involved in circuit and district work in Austria. And you'll remember, going back to what I was saying about these little anecdotes that seem to be inserted for the sole reason of impressing people.
Here we go.
There's another little one here. Sometimes I traveled by train from congregation to congregation carrying heavy suitcases. Most brothers did not own a car, so no one was able to pick me up at the train station. In order not to show off, I did not want to take a taxi to the home where I was to stay, so I would walk to my accommodations. It's just like, you've literally given an anecdote about the length that you went to not show off, and in giving that anecdote, you are showing off.
I don't mean to show off these impressive muscles or anything, but this just, it's been a long day and I'm tired and I don't want to make anybody feel bad about how beautiful I look today or anything like that. Oh, come on. He needs to hear to talk about loving oneself.
Yeah. I just found that so funny. Here's a story about me being a really modest person. 1965, he graduates from the 41st Gilead class. On his return, he was assigned back to Austria, and on his return in 1967, April of 1967, he marries Meret. I think that's how you pronounce it. I could be wrong. When I arrived back in Austria, he says, I was assigned to a circuit where I met Tove Meret, an attractive single sister. She was raised in the truth from the time she was 5 years old. When brothers ask us how we met, we jokingly say, the branch office arranged for that. Not that the branch is too invasive in people's lives or anything. We got married a year later in April 1967, and we were allowed to continue in the traveling work together. Now, what do you do a year after getting married? Of course, you start taking the emblems, which is what he started doing in 1968 to signal that he was part of the anointed. In 1976, he's appointed to the Austrian branch committee in Vienna. And in 1989, so that would be 13 years later, he accompanies Theodor Gerrit on a special trip to Romania in an experience that was recounted in the 2018 annual meeting. And I will show you a clip.
I was serving at the Austria branch from about mid-70s to 1990. We had a small department that was assigned to help certain countries in Eastern Europe. And so from the separated group, there were Brother Albu, who was the leader, and 4 of his main elders. And from our side, there was Brother Gerrit, our translator, and I was part of that group. Also, there were several from the country committee of Romania. I remember the first night there was a lot of accusations about what the others had done and not done, which did not create the best spirit. And we mainly listened. And so the decision was made. It doesn't happen every day that 5,000 brothers come back to the organization.
So during this meeting, it seems that they met with these individuals who were running this renegade faction almost of Jehovah's Witnesses, and they managed to convince them to rejoin the approved organization in Romania. And for me, I don't know whether you guys recall the meeting, but it was interesting to see him welling up on camera and getting all emotional when he recounted that story.
Wow, a renegade Jehovah Witness group. So,
it seems there are such things, especially in Romania. Yes, apparently there still are in Romania some factions. I was speaking to my colleague Arthur about that recently. So yes, he had this meeting, and it went down in Jehovah's Witness history as a great success because 5,000 Jehovah's Witnesses were integrated into the organization, concerning which Gerrit says, what a victory for Jehovah and what a blow for Satan. So
my question is, why would they, if they both have the same mission, why would they need to join forces? Why couldn't they each just have their own thing? Is it like a money thing where it's like,
because they had to be, well, it had to be controlled by the organization. They couldn't just call themselves Jehovah's Witnesses and not be controlled by Watchtower.
Or they'd get sued.
Basically, yeah, it's sued for copyright infringement or whatever.
They copied our God and religion.
So July 1990, Gerrit is transferred to Brooklyn, and he serves, I don't know what it means. I think this was from 1994 in the announcement. It says he served in the executive offices. Are you familiar with that expression, Phil?
No, I was just kind of wondering if it was, just pre, you know how they always say they were in the service department. Is that the term they use at that point? Or
well, he's not So, yeah, it could be that that's what they mean, but I just found executive offices. Again, this is from a 1994 article announcing his appointment. It's just an odd wording that's certainly, to my knowledge, not used today. In 1992, he's appointed as a helper to the Service Committee, and obviously the Service Committee has oversight of the Service Department. And as we discussed in our last episode, the Service Department is where all the nasty stuff goes down and where abuse gets covered up and all that sort of thing. So you could say that Gerrit, even before his appointment to the governing body, again was being exposed to the very worst of the organization and apparently was okay with it. So
once again, to become a governing body member, you have to be able to stomach all the horrible things that goes down in the organization and come out on top of it, while also being, of course, anointed. But yeah,
that's a recurring theme, isn't it?
Yeah.
It should be noted that Gerrit Lösch is the longest serving governing body member at this time. He was appointed in July 1st, 1994. So if even the longest serving governing body member had to go through this process of, again, being exposed to the very ugliest side of the organization in order to be appointed, I guess that says it all, doesn't it?
Wow.
20 years later, we now jump to him being a full-fledged governing body member, of course, and I'll obviously take your comments as to what your most memorable recollections of his service are. But for me, the standout episode or event during his office as a governing body member was February 5th, 2014. There's a statement signed by Gerrit Lösch denying all involvement with Watchtower, and he signed this statement in an effort to get out of a subpoena to appear in the Jose Lopez lawsuit. The statement read in part, "I am not and never have been a corporate officer, director, managing agent, member, or employee of Watchtower. I do not direct and have never directed the day-to-day operations of Watchtower. I do not answer to Watchtower. I do not have and never have had any authority as an individual to make or determine corporate policy for Watchtower or any department of Watchtower. Watchtower does not have and never has had any authority over me."
It's very interesting how quick they're willing to just throw away all powers that they have whenever their feet gets held to the fire. Like I remember when who was it? I think it was Godfrey Jackson. That when he was held, when his
did you say Godfrey Jackson?
Jeffrey.
Is that Jeffrey's twin brother?
Yeah.
Jeffrey and Godfrey.
Sound like a
The Jackson
British
family.
Yeah, it's like a British house cleaner. But anyway, Godfrey, come. But Jeffrey Jackson, he when his feet got held to the fire in the Australian Royal Commission, once again, we never said that we're the only way that God communicates, and it'd be very bad if we did say something like that. Like they're so quick to just throw away any power they have whenever they're pressed or whatever. Now I guess it could be considered theocratic warfare, where it's okay for them to lie in that situation. But I find that very weird how quick they are to just, oh no, that's not me. Nope, I have no parts of that. Nope, you're looking for somebody else. You're looking for this brother in the service department. Yeah, that's who you're looking for, not me, Like they always seem to do that.
Phil, I guess if you're a Jehovah's Witness apologizing for this, you could say, well, technically speaking, what he said is accurate, because he's saying, I do not have and never have had any authority as an individual. He does have authority as a member of the governing body. In other words, the governing body has authority over Watchtower, and Watchtower is an instrument of the governing body. But as a lone individual by himself, he does not have equal authority to the governing body. So on a technicality, it's true, but it's all given as a statement to outsiders who aren't familiar with all the nuances. It's definitely misleading. And also, if you were to stand up in a Kingdom Hall meeting and say the words, Watchtower does not have and never has had any authority over me, you would be frog marched to the back room pretty quickly.
You would, wouldn't you? Yeah, I don't know if that was on their mind when they split the board of directors and the governing body in the 70s there, but I mean, it definitely worked out well. And I have to imagine that's part of the idea now, is that even if Watchtower got sued and and people got convicted, that it would be the Watchtower Society officers that would go to prison, the president and secretary, treasurer, and the governing body would still be in the clear to keep chugging along, running the organization.
As a once great Jehovah Witness video once said, if it's 10% true, it's 100% misleading. So for them to say something like that, knowing what it fits perfectly, man. These guys, they shoot themselves in the foot so often. I'm just literally baffled at the stuff that they put out.
I got massively criticized. I say massively. I had a few comments criticizing me for misquoting the video by saying if it's 10% incorrect, it's 100% misleading. You've just said 10% true. I think the actual word was 10% correct. So for those of you who need me to be absolutely 100% correct, allow me to interject and correct Jay on his quote.
My apologies. My apologies.
Yeah. Shame on you, Jay. Shame on you for trying to mislead people there.
Oh, it was only 10% of me that was misleading.
But what do we have to say about Gerrit Lösch as a governing body member? How would you characterize his role on the governing body and some of the standout things in his time in that capacity?
I mean, I'll be honest, nothing much stands out to me. I guess as I read his life story, I thought it was a pretty boring life story. I don't know if the charm is worn off these articles, but just the standard, ascent through the organization. I guess the one thing I'll say, he's a good looking guy. He's kind of got that James Garner look going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a quiet guy. I mean, even when he gives his talks and stuff, there's nothing about him that you could really like hang on to. He's a soldier for Watchtower, He just comes in, he says what he needs to, he gets done whatever he needs to get done as far as his obligations for JW broadcast, and he literally gets zero attention. You'll never catch him at the Bottle King or riding in a drop top Corvette or anything like that. Just he's an old school JW.
I guess there are a few things I have to say about him, and then we'll move on to Anthony Morris. I find it interesting that in his life story, he talks about apostolic succession and about how it was questioning apostolic succession that led him to becoming a Jehovah's Witness. Apostolic succession is the teaching that essentially the Pope is a descendant of Peter. So Jesus gave the keys of the kingdom apparently to Peter, and that was giving him a mantle of authority that gets passed down from Pope to Pope through this process of apostolic succession. And when Gerrit Lösch learned that this wasn't what it was cracked up to be as a teaching, it led to his whole beliefs unraveling. And I make the point in my book that you can say exactly the same thing about the slave teaching. Once you manage to unpick the slave teaching, which it's very easy to do by applying logic, again, the whole thing unravels, because it's more or less the same thing today with the governing body. Even if you want to believe that Jesus chose the governing body in 1919, how do we get to the governing body in 2020. So who gets to decide when someone dies who should replace them? Well, that's basically apostolic succession, whatever you want to call it. So that's one interesting thing.
And
yeah, go on, Phil.
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna say and that's kind of interesting about Gerrit is he's sort of the missing link between the governing body of the Fred Franz era and the new governing body, because he was like the young guy when he got appointed, and in a few years all the old guard had died, and now he's the old guy with all these new fellas. So that's kind of interesting.
It is
Maybe
interesting.
He's the thing that's overlapping, he's the one overlapping generation piece that's holding on to that, millions of today will never die. I guess he's one of them.
Well, he mentions Theodore Gerrit in his life story, and obviously Gerrit is mentioned as well in the reenactment that I showed earlier. I don't think that, without wanting to say too much, I don't think that's a name that will age very well in terms of establishing someone's credentials. I think that's a name that people will want to distance themselves from, if anything, in the future, without, again, going into too much detail. But if I'm going to isolate some of the things that Gerrit Lösch has said that are unfortunate, he had some very strange ideas, or voiced some very strange ideas about Armageddon, imagining there being teams of brothers, in his words, who for years after Armageddon would do nothing other than bury the dead. So here's a recording of him saying that.
And Jehovah perhaps is going to use radiation to cause this phenomena that people's flesh will rot away as they are standing on their feet. It will be a destruction as mankind has never seen before. When Armageddon will happen, after that, it will be a time for liberation for God's people. Not only the destruction of enemies, but liberation and relief in many ways. But there will also be a lot of work to do, because we've mentioned that in Armageddon, billions of people will die, and they have to be buried. The Bible indicates in the prophecy that there will be groups of people, of brothers and sisters, that will for a long time do nothing else than just bury the dead.
So he has this grim vision of what the new world will look like for years after Armageddon has been and gone. He's also voiced some very strange ideas about higher education, likening it could be said, to some kind of brain disorder.
This reminds me of an experience that was mentioned in our literature about a young man that had a compulsory behavior. He was always forced to wash his hands many times a day. Just couldn't stop doing that. He hated himself so much for it that finally he decided to kill himself. He bought himself a gun and he pulled the trigger, and the bullet went through his head, but he survived. And some went to college and survived. Now this young man survived, and the bullet had hit this part of the brain that was responsible for his compulsory behavior. After he recovered, he was normal. So the question is, yes, he survived college. In that case, we can apply it to college. He survived that operation, the bullet operation. But would we recommend that to others? That's a different matter.
And he's also been found on JW Broadcasting to be pouring scorn on social media and even citing YouTube as a dubious source of information.
Today, rumors are occasionally being spread in electronic form about the faithful slave. This has caused some concern on the part of some brothers, especially when the reports are commenting on court cases where some in the organization were accused. Avoid sensationalism by saying something like, "Can you believe what I heard about this matter or that matter?" or this person or that person, referring to a statement that may have appeared on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter.
So even though he has this image of being like the grandfather of the governing body, he hasn't been shy when it comes to being almost on the front line in voicing some of the more contemptible ideas in the Jehovah's Witness faith.
I always find it funny how whenever there's something that goes against the Jehovah Witness organization's teachings, as far as like apostasy, they're quick to throw out like, "Oh, you're mentally diseased. There's something wrong with your mind." Like, are you kidding me? Like every time now it's, oh, you go to school, it's something wrong with your brain. That's what it is. That's why you're trying to get stuff inside of it, because it's broken, it's leaking, obviously. And if you learn that there's something wrong with the organization and you leave and you try to speak out about it, your brain is broke. That's what it's always, they always go to mentally diseased or just mentally not with all of your faculties. You know what I mean? Like, why do they do that?
Yeah, to liken the desire to go through higher education to dealing with some kind of brain disorder, yeah, it really is. It's sinking to the lowest, isn't it? To describe people who simply want to better themselves in that way is appalling. But that brings us to the end of Gerrit Lösch, and we move on to an interesting and noteworthy governing body member, Anthony Morris III.
I should probably go get a drink for this. I feel like you can't have this discussion sober. You need to at least have some bottle next to you to get relaxed, you know?
And Phil has the unenviable task of picking through the labyrinth of information that we do have on him. Yeah.
Yes, so do try and keep me on track. There's you can definitely go down the rabbit hole here.
Yeah.
But, well, let's see. So, well, maybe what I could just say is because in a couple of my videos, I've touched on this idea of him being Anthony Morris III and whether that was true or not, because that kind of jumped out at me when I started getting his military records that they all said Anthony Morris Jr. And so that, you know, seemed a little sketchy. But just in the last, this is good timing, because in the past week or two, I got this huge dump of information, genealogy information from a lady named Sarah, who is very interesting. She's not a witness or anything. She just is like a family tree, a genealogy buff. And she got into Tony Morris.
Wow.
And so she sent me this the whole family tree of the Morris family.
Oh, I've got to see that. Can I show it?
I'm sure, yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, I'll send that on to you guys. So just to kind of explain everything that she's found out, if we go back to Tony's grandfather, his grandpa was named Anton Skaterelech. He was born 1892. He spoke Russian. He emigrated to the United States. He married a lady named Rose Walenska in 1916 in Poland. And so Anton and Rose had 3 kids, and the youngest was named Anthony John Skaterelech. He was born 1921 in Cleveland. And this is Tony's father, Tony of the governing body.
Okay.
Now, Anton, after that, he split. He took off and left the family in the lurch. Nobody knows what happened to him.
Come on, Anton, you got to do better than that.
Right?
I know people named Anton.
So Rosie remarried. Her second husband, either he died or he split too. So she married her third husband. His name was John Moros, Moros, in 1925. So this is when Anthony Skaterelech Jr. is about 5 years old. And the whole family eventually kind of moseyed up to Saginaw, Michigan. Their last name, Moros, got anglicized to Morris. And so somewhere along that line, Anthony Skaterelech Jr. becomes Anthony Morris. He took his stepdad's last name.
Hang on a minute. Are you telling me that Tony Morris is actually Tony Skaterelech?
That's the family he comes from, yep.
But he was born... Are you telling me he was born Anthony Skaterelich.
His
That's his
father
birth name.
was.
Oh, his father was. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
We're
How is he
establishing
the
his father.
third or the second? Is he the second Morris or the second Skatoliich?
right. So the second Morris, the third Anthony. Yeah. So
okay.
yeah. So the
So
second
Anton, they count Anton?
if you count Anton, exactly.
Okay.
But the first wasn't even a Morris; he was a Skaterelich.
Right. Exactly.
That is bizarre, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it is misleading numbering, isn't it?
It is sketchy. Yeah. So you can see why Tony's mom always called him Anthony Morris Jr. He was the second one. But yeah, if you kind of squint your eyes just right, you can see how Tony thinks, well, I am the third Anthony in the lineage.
But look, I mean, I'm not disputing people who choose to use Roman numerals, but if you're going to use them after your name, at least let's have them accurate. And that, for me, seems very sketchy use of Roman numerals if you're going to insist on them, you know?
Yeah, that sounds like it's only 10% correct.
Which is 100% misleading. That's fascinating, Phil. Thank you. What more can you draw our attention to?
Yeah, okay. And so just
I'm like a kid in a candy shop at this moment.
Oh, I know. And just to put to rest, he is not connected to the Philip Morris tobacco empire at all.
Okay.
So Tony's dad, he eventually got married. He married a lady named Shirley. Now Tony's dad died. So Tony was born 1949. And then his dad died when he was about 11 years old. So 1961, died of a heart attack. So he lost his dad young. Tony's mom remarried in 1965 to a divorced fellow in Saginaw named Victor Grassmick. So that's Tony's stepdad. And as you read things, I mean, Tony definitely speaks very fondly of his stepdad. So evidently they were pretty close. Victor,
I think I have a clip of Tony Morris speaking about his stepdad.
And I have to tell you this here because we know so many of you. You know, my dad's a wealthy man, and my mother, and they're not Jehovah's Witnesses. He's 92, and she's high 70s. And he's always wondering, well, where's all that money going, you know? And did somebody stealing? And you're just stupid, Tony, you know, and they're taking advantage of you. So not long ago, he says to me, you know, what are they doing with the money, the they? And I told him, I said, look, I'm part of the they. It's not happening. And he went, oh. That's part of the they. I tell you. So...
Yo, that's what?
I am the they. Yeah.
Yo, that should be on everybody's T-shirt right now. I am the they.
Yeah.
It is catchy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So his stepdad was had like a restaurant or bar up in Saginaw, and eventually after the kids grew up, the parents moved down to Florida, and it kind of reminded me of the Letts parents. The family got really into real estate and buying condos and stuff. So when Tony talks about his dad in that clip being a wealthy man, he's talking about his stepdad, Victor, there.
Mm.
And yeah, they did quite well. His stepdad and his mom died. They both died by 2013. And Tony, and he has two brothers, John and Ron, and each of them definitely inherited a good chunk of change after his mom died there. Just the house that they sold they each got about 35 grand on top of the bank accounts and whatnot. So I think it's safe to say that Tony definitely has a good amount of his own money that he could use at various establishments if he wanted to.
But yeah, but I don't want to give him too much credit there, because it's one thing to have that money when he's young and before he's starting a long career as a circuit overseer and you know, and taking a vow of poverty. I'm not convinced that whatever he inherited would have necessarily lasted all that long unless it was invested. And do we have any evidence of him doing like what Stephen Lett's doing and getting involved in the property market?
Right. So he didn't inherit the money until 2013.
Oh,
So
really?
just a few years ago.
Oh, that's interesting.
Did he inherit that after taking the vow of poverty then?
Yeah, how would that work with the vow of poverty if you inherit a massive amount of money?
Right.
I'd have to check that with my... Should I go and get my little vow of poverty thing? Talk among yourselves. Sorry we couldn't have planned this more, viewers. We have these conversations organically, and we don't know necessarily where they're going to take us. But having just had this brought to my attention, I'm interested to know what the vow of poverty stipulates as regards inheriting money, and I'm consulting Dwelling Together in Unity. This is the 2004 version, which an ex-Bethelite sent to me. I'm not aware of too many copies of these in circulation because you have to relinquish them.
With everybody being quarantined right now, I think that book is very necessary.
So let me just see here. Right, so it says, part of the vow of poverty says that I vow as follows, and then blah, 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 to abstain from secular employment without permission from the order, to turn over to the local organization of the order all income received from any secular work or personal efforts in excess of my necessary living expenses, unless released from this vow by the order. I guess personal efforts, going back to Stephen Lett, that would surely include income from investments, wouldn't it?
And inheritance, right?
Well, that's the thing. I guess inheritance is a bit more sketchy, because would inheritance be classed as personal efforts? I would submit no. But then
Tony would too.
To accept such provisions for members of the order, be they meals, lodging, expense reimbursements, or others, as are made in the country where I serve, regardless of the level of my responsibility or the value of my services. And that wording at the end is worth noting for those who suggest, oh, this is just for Bethelites. No, the vow of poverty applies, again, regardless of the level of my responsibility. So it goes all the way to the top. The vow of poverty applies also to governing body members, to be content and satisfied with the modest support that I receive, as long as I am privileged to serve in the order. Should I choose to leave the order, or should it be determined that I no longer qualify to serve in the order, I will not expect any remuneration. So I suppose, given what you've said, that he inherited it in 2013, it's not inconceivable that what he was spending at Bottle King was his own money. But even so, even if it was his own money, you're then left with, but he's milking kids for their ice cream money. There's no way around it, is there?
You would hope that he would take all that inheritance and donate it, especially.
You would think so. I think inheritance should be viewed in the same light as ice cream money in that context. Yeah.
I've seen several things. I don't know if it's all like completely 100% backed up, but they've asked people to, in their will, leave like a certain, people ask them to leave them donations, stocks, land, property, and all type of other things in their will. So you would think somebody in that position would want to lead lead by example there, you think? Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, we digress. Bottlegate is much, much later in this story.
Yes. So if we go back, right. So Tony grew up in Saginaw, Michigan, is where he was from. He went to high school there. He graduated there. Interestingly, he played varsity basketball on the team.
Oh, Tony could hoop, huh? Oh man. Tony's a hooper. Wow, varsity too, huh?
Yeah, in fact,
another one of those little impressive nuggets that he just threw in there, probably.
And we have a nifty photo, which I'll send to you, Lloyd, but we have this awesome photo of him in his basketball uniform.
Wearing short shorts.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed, which is very fun when you compare it to his comments about how young men should dress.
Yeah. It'd be interesting to see him in the same uniform today, wouldn't it? There's a mental image for you. Yeah.
So after he graduated high school in '68, he was drafted into the Army. This was during the Vietnam War. And he served 2 years there. So it's kind of interesting. He's one of 2 veterans on the governing body, along with Sam Hurd. And so it's kind of funny from one standpoint. You can say, since they're so small right now, that a quarter of the governing body have served in the military.
Although Sam Hurd, as we established, was posted to Germany, post-war Germany, you could say that Vietnam was a whole other story. And I actually have some clips of Tony describing his experience in Vietnam.
I had been in bomb shelters when I was in Vietnam, young soldier. I did operating room work there, but when I first got there, they were bombing. After you got my orientation up around Long Binh, I went down into the Delta, was down there for some months, and they were bombing all the time. It was like the 4th of July, but it was real. Not a pleasant thing, these wars. Well, anyway, I was working 12-hour shifts, 7 in the morning till 7 at night. Later, I switched and went to night one. So I got tired, even though I was young and I loved working, I loved medicine. And so when I go to bed, I remember when I was first there, just my first few days there, they started bombing us, sending in these mortars. Morris, get up, because what do you mean get up? I heard the bombs too, dummy, So get your helmet. So I had to get a helmet and a flak jacket and all this stuff to go down in the bunker, which was right there by where our barrack was there. I get in there, and it held about 20, as I recall. It's not an exact science in the memory of that. But I'm looking around at all them wearing their helmets and the flak jackets. Of course, mine was brand new fatigues. Everybody knew I was brand new. So I'm looking at all of them. I said, hey, let me ask you a question. What? Because they're all nervous. I can tell they're nervous, and let me learn something here. I said, what happens if one of those mortars hits us directly? I said, so this is a coffin. So, and I don't recommend this, and I was young. I'm just telling you the experience. So from henceforth, I didn't get out of bed. And they'd say, you're nuts. I said, forget it, and I'm not going on a coffin. I said, I hope it doesn't hit you. And one night, a big chunk of shrapnel tore my locker up, by the way. I was so glad that hit the locker instead of me. So they could say it was foolish. I got used to it. I said, I got to get some sleep sometime. And now, it's just very, very concerning for me. You see, I was in Vietnam, a medic in that war. I've seen what happens to humans when they're mangled. You see it on TV and some of that. Well, till you smell human flesh burning from a helicopter crash. People that look like humans, like a hot dog on a grill, blackened and splitting open. I know what's coming at Armageddon. A lot of dead people. A lot of dead people. So it's absolutely urgent for us to get our minds off ourselves. And let's get out there and help as many as we can, because when it comes, it's going to be numbing for you. You think seeing a deer mangled on the side of the road from a truck that hit it is upsetting? You see humans like that. So it's going to be numbing.
Yeah.
And he ruined hot dogs for me forever, man. Those barbecue hot dogs used to be so good to me. Now Tony done ruined it for all of us.
Seriously, though, I think, and here's my theory, having read his story and following his career with quite some interest, my theory is that Anthony Morris is suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder from his experience in Vietnam. I think his decision to join Jehovah's Witnesses, as Phil is going to fill us in on, is partly influenced by that post-traumatic stress disorder and seeking relief to some degree from his experience. And based on his clip that we've just played now of him likening Armageddon victims to human hot dogs, I think to a degree his hatred and his fanaticism is influenced by his Vietnam experience, and he is projecting his PTSD on millions of followers.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And that's the thing, when he got back from Vietnam in the 70s, there was no real PTSD treatment. I mean, the only thing vets could do was drink. And there's a lot of more options now for vets, but is a witness going to take advantage of them? I mean, is Tony going to go to a VA hospital and for a, outpatient support group, or be seeing a psychologist? It's a little doubtful that he has any options besides drinking.
Indeed.
Hey, he's definitely taking advantage of that option.
Well, he is. And like you say, to a degree, you can kind of understand that. I mean, he's self-medicating. It would be interesting to know the extent of his involvement in Vietnam. I mean, Long Bin was a base. I think we can show a picture of it, that I would imagine was fairly well guarded. When you think of Vietnam, you immediately think of platoons going out in the jungle and just getting picked off one by one. I'd be doubtful personally that he was ever in that sort of situation. I always imagine him receiving casualties coming in and treating them, which would have been horrific by itself, but not probably as traumatizing as being hunted down in the jungle. Maybe he was hunted down in the jungle. It would be nice to hear again these anecdotes. We probably never will hear the extent of it all.
I've seen, like, I'd like to look at like old school war documentaries and stuff like that, but they definitely had infantry medical staff that were on like shoulder to shoulder with the infantrymen, and they would of course have these big white like Red Cross on their arm to let the other people know that they were medical staff, which is kind of messed up because the enemy soldiers would specifically aim at them first so that they couldn't render aid to any fallen soldiers. So if he did that job, not only was he in danger constantly, but he's seen the worst parts of the war. And he not only did he see it, he had to heal it and take care of it and, choose who is going to die and who's not going to die on the battlefield in a split second, So, yeah, that could trigger some heavy duty PTSD in somebody.
Yeah, for sure. And based on his records, he was an operating room specialist. So I think it was more so that he was right in the base hospitals there working with the surgeons.
Wow, okay.
But even then, you're going to be traumatized, aren't you? I watched, I can't think of the name of it now, but I'll put a thumbnail up or some image to show you the documentary that I watched. Now, I think it's actually required viewing for everyone to understand not just the horror of the Vietnam conflict, but also of the horror of war full stop, and how easily countries can get dragged into poorly thought out military conflicts. But there's an interesting anecdote where a soldier describes his mother phoning him and saying, "You're the one. You're going to come home safe. You're the one who's going to come home safe." And he says something like, "And I said to my mother, or I didn't want to say to my mother, I'm putting bits of people whose mothers have told them they're coming home safe in bin bags every day, so it really was, even just serving in the operating room or in the hospital, you're going to be seeing horrific things on a daily basis, and that is going to seriously mess with you.
I just don't think somebody who has gone through something like that and who haven't received the proper therapy from it should be in charge of a group of 8 million people. I just don't think, until he gets the proper mental treatment necessary, instead of self-medicating, he's just literally not in a position to be entrusted to 8 million people. And not just any type of trust. I mean, to the point to whereas their literal lives are on the line as far as the blood doctrine and stuff like that. He's just not in a position to be trusted to make those type of decisions for that large of an amount of people.
There's definitely hints in his story that his time in the army had a big impact on him psychologically. I'm just trying to find the quotes now. The wounded were prepared and then rushed. Oh, here we go. A full account to some degree, at least. Soon after I reported for duty at a surgical hospital in the Mekong Delta in Dong Tam, numerous helicopters filled with casualties arrived. I was very patriotic and loved to work, so I wanted to get involved right away. The wounded were prepared and then rushed to the small air-conditioned metal containers that served as operating rooms. There, a surgeon, an anaesthetist, a scrub nurse, and a circulating nurse were crammed into the tiny space, doing their best to save lives. I noticed that some cargo in large black bags was not unloaded from the helicopters. I was told that those bags contained the body parts of soldiers who had been blown apart in battle. That was my introduction to war.
Jesus Christ, that's crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah, and the word you see he uses several times is being numb. I think in one of those clips he talks about how it's going to be numbing to see the carnage at Armageddon, and in his life story he says he felt numb after getting back stateside. And I think, oh yeah.
He directly references. I was just espousing the theory that his PTSD influences who he is now as a person, and he basically says that. If you read on in the story, one day during the time I was living in my car, I arrived at the Kingdom Hall a couple of hours before the group met for field service. I had just finished my shift at the hospital. As I sat behind the Kingdom Hall, where no one could see me, the memories of Vietnam, the smell of burned human flesh, and the sight of blood and gore began to overwhelm me. In my mind, I could hear and vividly see young men begging me, "Am I going to make it? Am I going to make it?" I knew they would die, but I tried to comfort them the best I could, while keeping my eyes from revealing the truth. As I sat there, I was flooded with emotion. I prayed as a torrent of tears poured down my cheeks. I began to think deeply about the resurrection hope. Then it hit me. By means of the resurrection, Jehovah God will undo all the carnage that I had seen and the emotional pain I and others had experienced. So he looked to his newfound beliefs as a means of coping, basically, as a coping mechanism. He talks about the horrors of war, and he's just described them there about knowing that there were bits of soldiers in bags, and yet he has spoken on the platform about the belief that was recently, it's fairly new light from the last 10 years, that the anointed will involve themselves in the slaughter. So there's now a belief that the anointed will go up to heaven just before Armageddon, and they will be involved in fighting the War of Armageddon. So Tony Morris will be going around turning humans into bits. So it kind of comes full circle. He's joined the religion as a means of relief from the horror that he's been exposed to. And according to what he now believes, he is going to be an instrument of similar horror in the future.
Oh man, us radioactive apostates ain't got a chance.
And I kind of connect that. I mean, I'm putting on my amateur psychologist hat, thinking about the soldiers that in Vietnam there that he couldn't save, the ones that died, on the operating room table. And I think there's a line in his life story, something about God will forgive me for the terrible things I've done, which I don't know if that's like survivor's guilt, but I kind of connect that to once he's anointed in heaven, he'll have the power to punish the bad guys, to do what he couldn't do in Vietnam and save everybody.
But the thing about that war is there were really no bad guys. It was just such a messed up conflict that should never really have happened. The Viet Cong, they were communists, but they were the ones, the Americans were the ones in their country, It was just a messed up situation where there were really no bad guys. It was just an unnecessary war that Tony was an instrument of. And again, by being an instrument of it, by being involved in that conflict, arguably his experience is manifesting itself in the decisions he's making and the things he's saying as a governing body member.
What I find especially crazy is the fact that he has the power to save people right now. He doesn't need to wait till a new system or anything like that. Like, there are literally people on the operating room table who have an opportunity to live or die. And he is in a position to save them by simply changing this blood doctrine, but he doesn't.
Yeah. And in fact, he went as far as to double down on the blood doctrine in this clip from a convention.
Well, one night, this is when it's very hard, but here's what happened. When Josh was in the hospital, he said, Mom, a lot of times when you go to the bathroom or go to get Dad, and doctors come in, and here's what they say, Josh, you need a blood transfusion. Without it, you will die. We want to help you. You know what Josh responded? All alone. Then please respect my wishes about blood. He said, I told one doctor who tried to get me to take blood, you may think I'm crazy, but I have all my thinking abilities. I just want to live by Jehovah's law on blood. He knows what is best for us. The best thing for me is to respect the sanctity of life, and if I die, I will live again. Good example of faith in the face of incredible stress and persecution. Amazing young fella. And when he's resurrected, see, you'll hear more from him because Jehovah loves that little fella.
So this is someone who, like you say, Jay, has the ability to spare more victims from the blood teaching, and instead he's doubling down on it.
And if you think about it, if he definitely was a medical nurse, do you know how many blood transfusions he had to administer to people back then?
That's a good point. Yeah, he will have been involved in
so many blood transfusions. It would like boggle your mind.
Yeah, definitely.
That's a good point. And one other point, I think it helps to explain why he is so cold or callous in some of his talks is, I mean, I never served in a war zone, but I was a RN in a bunch of years in a trauma ICU in a trauma hospital. And you kind of put this shell on after a while where you kind of have to like protect your psyche so you don't get scarred by all the, bad stuff you see happening. And I think he's just never taken that shell off or never, worked through it. And so you get comments like, doesn't bother me when he's talking about what's coming.
Regarding the coronavirus, yeah.
What we're experiencing right now in this global pandemic, I was telling the branch class yesterday, It doesn't bother me. We've been waiting for this. We knew things like this were going to happen. Christ Jesus has prepared us. Where's the shock?
That will not age well, will it?
Indeed. Indeed.
So where do we go next?
All right. Well, he got back and so we find him next in 1971. He was in West Palm Beach, where I think his parents had moved down there by that point. And he's just kind of like a lot of Americans, trying to find answers, and starts visiting all the churches down there, and eventually popped into a Kingdom Hall. And much like Sam heard, what impressed Tony was all the little kids and how well they seemed to know their Bibles. He accepted a Bible study from Jim Gardner, who was an older anointed brother in the hall there. And of course, this was the pre-1975, so I'm sure it was kind of appealing to have that, hope that, hey, maybe paradise will be here in 4 years. But yeah, and so, Tony, he was not half-hearted. He jumped right in with both feet. In a few weeks, he was an unbaptized publisher. He talks
When
about,
did he become an unbaptized publisher? Sorry.
Oh, I think the phrase he says is just a few weeks after he started studying.
Okay. And sorry, what year was this?
So that was February of 71.
So we're again talking about the build up to 1975, aren't we? So he was doing all this under the assumption that the paradise that the books were describing was going to come within a few years, because the 1975 teaching was introduced in the Life Everlasting in Freedom of the Sons of God book in 1966. So 1971, he's literally going around placing that book with people and pointing to 1975 as a year of great significance in Bible prophecy. He's being lied to, and he's becoming complicit in lying to others. But it's a prophecy that never came true.
It's funny how you can become like, you come in at that time, because a lot of people who did come in, I know that they had their biggest growth right before 1975, and then they had their biggest decline immediately after 1975. It's funny that he not only stayed on board, but eventually took control, Mm-hmm. What type of reasoning does one have to go through mentally to accept they've been lied to and just find a new lie to hold on to,
Mm.
For sure. And he mentions aggressively preaching to his family to try and get them, on board as well, to the point that his parents asked him to leave their house down there. He says, "I've learned to be much more tactful now." So,
of course you have.
I'd hate to see him back then, I guess.
If what we're seeing now is a tactful Tony Morris, I'd hate to see what he was like before. Good grief.
For sure. So he studied with Jim Gardner. He went to the memorial down there, which was in April. So that's just a little tidbit to keep in mind, because at some point along the line, Tony starts professing to be of the anointed. And so I don't know if hanging around with an anointed person kind of, he had a connection there. But in May, so in May, he left Florida and he went back up to Saginaw, which is where his bank account was. In July, we find he got baptized at the district assembly at Yankee Stadium in New York. And somewhere, I don't know if it was at the assembly, but somewhere along the line, he met his future wife, Susan Kettle, who was from Cranston, Rhode Island. And they ended up getting married in December that year. And they were both regular pioneering. So, a very rapid timeline. He studied 4 months. He was baptized 6 months when he got married. They'd only known each other a few months. I'm super interested to know if he was a ministerial servant when he got married, because I think, doesn't he have a talk where he recommends that?
Yes. This was the 2014 branch meeting when he gave his infamous tight pants tirade. But he also, that wasn't the only crazy thing that he said in that talk. He also suggested that if any sisters were contemplating marrying a brother who was over the age of 23 and not yet a ministerial servant, they were wasting their time.
You know, a man that's not serving, there should be a real good reason why they're not serving as a ministerial servant. Remember, sister, you know how elders get put in awkward positions. What's the story of this brother? I'm interested in marrying him, but they had already gone too far along. But I tried to tell her, I said, well, think about it. He's 23 years old. He's not a ministerial servant. She married him. She paid for that wrong decision. 23 years old and you're not serving as a ministerial servant?
Yeah.
Was this the same talk where he said if you're of age to drive and you're not baptized, maybe you should get your license?
The clip Jay is referring to is this.
But as you get older, you are responsible. Remember the nice demo? We've mentioned that before. Well, I'm not ready to get baptized. Okay, let's hold off on your driver's license. What? I'm 16. What are you talking about? I'm ready. I know I'm ready. Yeah, you're ready for a driver's license, but you're not ready to dedicate your life. Explain that one to heaven. That's why we repeated it on the program.
No, I don't think it was the same talk. But, I mean, look, there's so much stuff to go on. He's just been so prolific in saying crazy things over the years. I mean, you could write a book about him, couldn't you? All the crazy stuff he's done and said. Yeah.
Yeah.
No license unless you're baptized. No marriage unless you're a ministerial servant.
But he gets married to Susan, and incidentally, we know what at least one of Susan's drinks of choice is following Bottlegate. We know that we know that Susan is partial to Jameson. So, yeah.
I see you're a fan of Scotch. Do you know anything about Irish whiskey?
Yeah. Not a lot. My wife likes it.
Yeah.
Jameson's always.
Yeah.
So yeah, after he got baptized, they just they got married, started pioneering, and now I have to correct myself because in my videos when I made it, I said that after Armageddon didn't come in '75, they kind of put the brakes on and started a family. But as I've been, doing more videos, that it seems like the witnesses kind of assumed that Armageddon was going to come in August or September of '75, and after that's when you see the numbers just drop off a cliff with hours and everything. And so their first son, Jesse, he was born in '75, which he would have had to be conceived, late '74, early '75. And so
don't try and imagine that, by the way. Go on. Yeah.
Yeah. And so initially I was kind of thinking, well, why would you have a child if you think Armageddon's coming in a few months? But just recently, in the last few months, there's been some posts on Reddit from Bethelites who were in Bethel in that time. And they were saying how Bethelites were leaving Bethel in '75, which I thought, wow, why would you? That was like the best place to be. But what they were saying was there was kind of a common belief at that time that after Armageddon, you might not be able to have sex or get married or have children.
Okay.
Which is kind of something you see in some of the literature hinted at.
Well, thank you for
correcting anything that'll make you
video.
leave Bethel, that's definitely it.
Thank you for correcting your video, Phil. Although, Jay, is there a quote that we can apply to information that's only 10% correct?
Oh, I believe there is a quote. If it's 10% correct, it's 100% misleading.
Shame on you, Phil. Shame on you for trying to mislead people in your video.
Where's my apostate mask to put on and show? Yes. So they did indeed start a family in '75, try and sneak at least one child in before Armageddon. And if you have to kind of connect the dots in all the Watchtower articles about their story, but both Tony and Susan quit pioneering in '75 after the end didn't come. And that, tons of witnesses did that. So yeah, Jesse was born in '75, and then they had a second son, Paul, in '77. Good Bible names there. So yeah, I think Tony is the only governing body member now that has ever been a parent, if I'm not.
He is. And that's something that he routinely milks when he's talking. In fact, he famously milked that when he gave his JW Broadcasting speech on the issue of CSA, I'm going to say, for the purposes of demonetization, although Vietnam's probably demonetized me, what we were saying about body bags. But yeah, so he frequently milks this issue of him being a father, but it should be noted he is the only one on the governing body out of 8 guys who has any experience at all in parenting. But that doesn't stop the governing body members who have no experience as a parent in giving parenting advice, to the point where you have someone like Stephen Lett, as we discussed in the last episode, suggesting what young ones should or should not be doing and what their behavior ought to be like as children. So yeah, he is a father, but boy does he milk it, you know.
It's his one calling card to actually living a real life. You know what I mean? Like, he has some real life experiences, and he milks all his real life experiences, if you think about it.
And some of his advice as a father, as we've just seen, is to blackmail your children into getting baptized. So let's just, put that out there.
Oh yeah, I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
Are these like ideas he came up with and used against his kid?
You have to ask, don't you? You do have to ask.
Indeed. Yeah.
In fact, that's what he said. He said in one of the times that he was giving that advice, he said, "We've had sons. We know how it works. This is how you handle it." So the implication being that is indeed the conversation that he had with his own sons. So goodness knows.
How about that? Well, his life so much mirrors the organization track as a whole. So, by the late 70s, early 80s, the disappointment had worn off. And so in 1979, Tony started pioneering again. And then after both boys started school, Susan started pioneering. So maybe 82, 83-ish. So they were taking care of Susan's parents. They were living in Rhode Island at that point. Her parents were elderly. Her mom actually died while she was living with the Morrises in 1986. But after her parents died, they had a little more flexibility to do stuff. And so the following year, in 87, they moved down to North Carolina to serve where the need was greater. And that's when Tony started working as a substitute circuit overseer. The boys started pioneering as they got older. Each of them went to Bethel when they turned 19. And then after both the boys had moved out, that's when the Morrises started serving full-time in the circuit work down there. So they did evidently some time down there. In 1998, they got a new circuit in Long Island. And then in 2000, they got a circuit in Massachusetts. And then in 2002 is when he's pulled off the road into Bethel to start kind of the standard ascension. So,
do we know what he was doing when he first arrived in Bethel?
Indeed, you'll never guess which department he was in.
Service department. Was it really?
It was. So service department, then a helper to the service committee of the governing body. And then in 2005, he and Jeffrey Jackson were appointed to the governing body.
Again, you have to know the worst of the organization and be okay with it. And that's a massive tick in the box towards making your way to the top, isn't it?
You have to be on the service department. Wow.
It seems. I mean, if you're a governing body helper now, maybe you're watching this, hello, and you have aspirations to becoming one day a governing body member, you have to be asking the question, yes, but have I yet served in the service department? Because that seems to be the route that you need to take,
Yeah, so that's kind of about all I got. I don't know if there's any especially awesome, things that have happened since then that we haven't mentioned.
I mean, look, there's just not enough time. I mean, we've already been talking about Tony Morris for quite some time at this point. you would need like an entire YouTube channel to go through all of the stuff that he's done over the years. And to a degree, you could say that YouTube channel is the John Cedars YouTube channel, because some of the very first videos I started making in 2012, many of which aren't even on the channel anymore because I was worried about copyright and I took them down. Some of my very first videos were recordings of his talks. So I've been following him for years and years. And I guess the series to watch, if you want some of the biggest examples of his buffoonery, are the Taking on Tony series. So please check out my Taking on Tony series if you want some more examples of him being a really controlling, narcissistic fool. But that's Tony Morris, and we move on to Mark Sanderson, the youngest member of the governing body, born in 1965 on February 4th, which would make him 55 years old, if my maths is correct. He was raised in San Diego, California. He was baptized in 1975 on February 9th at the age of 9. And here is a recording of him encouraging similar for other children.
You know, I look down in the audience here, and you're not able to see all you dear brothers who are tied in for this broadcast, but I have right in front of me brother and sister Hopkinson, brother and sister Kelsey.
Ihr könnt jetzt nicht die Zuhörerschaft sehen, die ich vor Augen habe, aber zum Beispiel hier in der ersten Reihe sitzen das Ehepaar Hopkinson und das Ehepaar Kelsey.
You know, all 5 of us, we have something in common.
Wir 5 haben etwas gemeinsam.
We were all baptized between the ages of 9 and 11.
Wir 5 sind gemeinsam im Alter zwischen 9 und 11 Jahren getauft worden.
It's the best decision I ever made.
Das war die beste Entscheidung, die ich je getroffen habe.
Let me ask you 4 here. Was it the best decision you ever made?
War das auch in eurem Fall die beste Entscheidung? Ja.
All 4 are nodding yes.
Ja, wir nicken alle.
Now, brothers, I want to ask you a question.
Nun möchte ich euch aber eine Frage stellen.
Do you share that viewpoint of the governing body?
Meine Frage ist, empfindet ihr genauso wie die leitende Körperschaft?
Are you helping your children to become unbaptized publishers and to make their dedication at a young age?
Helft ihr lieben Eltern wirklich?
So again, as someone who's never been a parent, he has quite a lot to say about parenting and the decisions that children ought to be making when they're way too young to be pledging themselves to organizations, it could be argued. 1983, September 1st, he begins pioneering in Saskatchewan, Canada, I think at the age of 18. 1990, feel free to jump in, Phil, because you've done a video on Mark Sanderson, so I realize that you've already researched this far deeper than I have, so feel free to jump in if you want to add anything. Or
Oh, just the only thing I would add, no, everything's right, that you would not that you would know it from the article, but he has a sister, Kim, who has left Jehovah's Witnesses and has been kind of whitewashed out of his story, I guess.
So
she did what? Oh my word!
With that bombshell, Phil, what can you tell us about Kim Sanderson?
Oh, let's see. She's 4 years older than Mark. And by the way, Mark is Douglas Jr., so he's another one that goes by his middle name.
Okay.
But yeah, she, I'm not for sure, but it seems like she left, kind of in her around 20, early 20s, she left the truth. Oh, what am I saying?
Phil.
But she is also a nurse. And so, so his family, he grew up in San Diego. And so she was a nurse in San Diego. She got married. They moved to Texas. She's like a manager at an OBGYN practice there. She has some daughters, some grandchildren. It looks like a super awesome family. It turned out really good.
Well, I can only say, and we don't want to pry too much into her life, but if Kim is ever interested in in a respectful exchange about her thoughts on the Jehovah's Witness organization. She has an open invitation to the John Cedars channel. That's all I'll say there, and I'm sure you would say the same about your channel, Phil. So let's see here. You were mentioning that you've mentioned his sister. He graduated from the 7th Ministerial Training School in the United States in December 1990. April 1991, he was appointed as a special pioneer for the island of Newfoundland, Canada.
I could jump in.
Sure.
Just one other thing. In the 80s, there's an interesting anecdote I ran across. So, not verified 100%, but it's talking about, it's an ex-witness, and he's talking about Mark going back to San Diego for a visit while he was in Saskatchewan. And one of the things he did was go visit an old anointed brother, Melvin Sargent, who's in the literature a lot. And he was like a noted collector of Watchtower literature. And a fellow I ran across named Mark O'Donnell, who you might have heard of, he was also into collecting Watchtower literature. And one of the lists there was like this little group that exchanged stuff. And Mark Sanderson was one of the names on that list in the 90s.
Yeah. I remember Mark telling me about that. So Mark's been an avid, like me. Well, Mark's been a collector of Watchtower materials for far longer than I have. Our collections are, you could say, comparable. But he indeed did run up against Mark Sanderson's name when he was in the process of acquiring that collection, because it does seem that, which again is interesting if you think about it, going back to what we were saying about knowing the worst and being okay with it. So if you are a collector of old Watchtower materials, you're going to know what all the various wrong teachings were going through the decades, and you're going to be fine with all of the wrong predictions, the flip-flops, etc. You're going to be cool with it, and you're still pressing ahead with the organization. So again, it's a peek into his character. So apparently,
because there's a certain thing whenever you can now. Okay, the everyday Jehovah Witness, you get the information or whatever, but you'll be surprised what they don't know, because you learn a lot after leaving. But when you find out that the people who are at the top, they know this stuff. This is not just some stuff that, because there's some stuff that I can tell my mother, who's been a Jehovah Witness for I all my life and more, obviously, since I was born in. But there's so much that she just doesn't know. Your everyday average Jehovah Witness just doesn't know so much stuff, and they know it all from top to bottom, good, bad light, new light, old light, and they just press on like it's nothing.
Yeah, when you're a collector, you're going to know a lot. And so it seems that Sanderson does know a lot, and he knows a bit in other areas as well, which I'm coming to. So apparently he served as a substitute circuit overseer for a period before being invited to the Canada Bethel in February 1997. A few years later, in November 2000, he was transferred to the United States branch to work in the Hospital Information Services Department, and later the Service Department. So we're seeing the same progression. I mean, Hospital Information Services, you are on the front line when it comes to not only defending the blood policy, but also you get an inside look at the casualties, at how many people are dying because of the blood policy. So he had his hands in all of that.
Man.
There was even, I actually wrote an article, back in 2012, about Sanderson's appointment, which I'll come to, because it was all a bit messy how it went down back in the day. But he was, and I wrote in my article, Sanderson worked in the Society's Hospital Information Services Department prior to being appointed. We learned this from a blog article back in the day. During his time in this position, Sanderson is said to have responded to a question about the number of fatalities among witnesses who have refused blood transfusions by saying that it was difficult to estimate such a figure. And yes, it's not that difficult, because if you look at various studies, there's one study in particular in New Zealand that when you run the numbers indicates that potentially tens of thousands of people have sacrificed their lives due to the blood teaching. So he was involved, he was in the thick of it with that before joining the service department. And actually, it was as recently as the March JW Broadcasting episode where he interviewed his mentor on the service department, Robert P. Johnson. Here's a clip.
You were the brother assigned to be my trainer when I came to the service department.
I remember that fondly.
And I know that I'm not the only one. I mean, you've really spent your whole life training other people.
Well, it's been a privilege. And I was trained. I was helped along the way. I was nobody special, but Jehovah's extended undeserved kindness to me and made all these things possible.
So there he is on JW Broadcasting, reminiscing about the good old days when R.P. Johnson was showing him the ropes at the service department. Here's an S77 form notification of disfellowshipping. Oh, this one's someone who's been disfellowshipped for abusing children. Here's how we input it in our database. Here's the buttons you press. Here's the filing system. That's the sort of thing that he would have been trained to do by someone like RP when he joined the service department. Again, you're seeing the worst of the organization. You're seeing the scope of what's going on, and you have to be okay with it. September 2008, Mark attends the School for Branch Committee members, and thereafter he's appointed as a member of the Philippines Branch Committee. 2010, September, he returns to the United States as a helper to the Service Committee. 2012, September 1st, he begins his appointment as governing body member. And now this was interesting. It was announced to the Bethel family, I think, on September 4th. And yet he'd been already a governing body member since September 1st. And I mention this because the way the news of his appointment was disseminated was extremely clumsy. If you think about Kenneth Cook, an announcement was made and everyone knew about it at the same time. Whether you're an ex-JW, whether you're a JW, everyone knew at the same time, the rank and file I'm talking about, that Kenneth Cook had been appointed as a governing body member. That's not how it happened with Mark Sanderson. With Mark Sanderson, he started working on the governing body. Then a few days later, the United States branch was let in on the secret. And then it became rumor. It went into the rumor mill. So I remember at the time you had ex-JWs spreading this rumor that there was this new governing body member called Mark Sanderson. And so we were kind of clued in on it, but we couldn't talk about it formally because there was no confirmation. And so I couldn't, for example, make videos about it or do articles about it because as far as we were concerned, it was just hearsay. And then this video went out in around November, December of 2012.
It is the custom for the Bethel family to share in a special meal and to benefit from personal expressions about Gilead from two of the students. Brother Mark Sanderson, serving as chairman for the noon program, made his first televised appearance to the Bethel family as a newly appointed member of the governing body.
So there's just this passing mention in a video providing confirmation on December 3rd, 2012. And then only quite a bit later do you get it confirmed in the actual magazine that he is a governing body member. It was disseminated in such a clumsy way.
Wonder why would they do that? Like, that makes such little sense. Was there something about them that they felt like, or were they trying something new where it's like, well, we make the decisions. We don't really have to inform you that we made a decision. So you'll find out when everybody else found out. Then they probably got some backlash from it. And now they're trying to be more professional about it, because it always, anytime a governing body member is appointed, you have to ask the question, how are they appointed? What's the process? What goes on with it? Was this an attempt to just try to maybe do it in a way to where is not a question and people can't really question it because it's done so covertly? Like, why would they do that?
If I had to guess, I mean, you'll have to ask them because obviously they improved things by the time Cook was appointed. But if I had to guess, maybe it was something to do with his age, because it was pretty sensational that they'd appointed someone so young. I mean, how old was he at the time? I think he was he 47 when he was appointed? So. That's very young. That's only 7 years older than me. That's very young to be a governing body member. So part of me is wondering whether they were kind of embarrassed about it. And so it was a case of, yeah, we want him on the governing body, but do we really have to tell everyone? And that's what it feels like for me. And a similar thing happened, by the way, with the new light about the faithful slave teaching, which came out at around the same time. It was disseminated in a clumsy way so that the rank and file didn't find out about it until quite a bit later after it had been decided on. So it's a part of the organization's history where they were clumsy, full stop, in disseminating information, and Sanderson's a good example. But in terms of the man himself, what can we say about him as a governing body member, would you say?
To be totally honest, I kind of, if I had stayed in the organization, I could see myself being Mark Sanderson.
Oh, really? You can imagine yourself being him.
To be modest. No.
Yeah.
Not the anointed
Y'all do got the hair thing in common.
That's right.
Jay, you had to go there. You had to go there.
I couldn't skip that.
I was holding off earlier when he was remarking about Gerrit Lösch's quiff. But you just had to go all the way. Okay, fair enough.
That beard would have to go, but
so Phil, why do you see yourself as a potential Mark Sanderson?
Well, I tell you, I kind of realized it when you, I think it was one of your recent videos where he was talking about, he had that talk where he was mentioning Bart Ehrman.
Yeah.
And I mean, that is like super edgy for a witness to be even without telling the name, but mentioning Bart Ehrman in a talk. I used to give some crazy talks when I was, that was like my thing. I had a talk one time where my whole introduction, I just played a long clip of a Martin Luther King Jr. speech over the sound system. And so I could just so within the sandbox of the organization, Mark is really edgy. He kind of pushes the envelope of, of research and knowledge about things.
You could say, skirts a bit close to the wire in terms of including information that could send potentially witnesses off in the wrong direction, would you say?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think I was saying in the last episode, he's fairly unremarkable in terms of his personality. And I was putting forward the theory in our last conversation that's again a plus point if you're looking at candidate governing body members. You want someone that's not going to stand out from the crowd too much, isn't too charismatic, and won't deflect attention away from the main characters on the governing body. I think that's a main reason why he was chosen. He was also clearly chosen because he's been batting for the organization over blood. He's been batting for the organization in the service department. He's been waist deep in the most terrible aspects of the organization, and he's been totally immune to the awfulness of it all, and that's a major plus point for him. He also seems to see himself as quite a scholar. I remember when they were doing the move to Warwick, and they were planning the Bible exhibit, and he was putting appeals out, I think, for rare Bibles, and he was explaining what Bibles they had, and it was almost as though he saw himself as almost like a Bible scholar, which in the context of his remarks about Bart Ehrman in the March episode, it's almost like there's a little bit of jealousy there where he's talking about an actual Bible scholar as opposed to his amateur attempts, you know. But apart from that, it's really just his comments about baptism that really get on my nerves. He seems to be mostly a by-the-book presenter. A lot of what he says is extremely predictable. If I had to choose a governing body member who is the most effective communicator in terms of being, you know, at least coming across as sincere and at least coming across as believable, it probably would be Mark Sanderson. I remember at the time when the Russian ban came about, he was jumping on JW Broadcasting to give a message to Russian Jehovah's Witnesses in Russian. Do we know whether he actually speaks Russian or whether he just practiced for that?
I was going to mention that. I believe he learned Russian, which would make sense because in Saskatchewan there's there was this sect from Russia, the Dubokers, I think is how you say it, and they all moved from Russia in the early 1900s and settled there. So that would kind of make maybe he learned Russian at that point.
So you think it did sound like he legit knew Russian, because I at the same time I thought anything Mark Sanderson can do, and I did my own message in Russian, and it was hard. You know, when you don't speak Russian, to try and speak it, it's hard. And I have at least a little bit of an advantage in speaking a little bit of Croatian, and there's one or two words that are similar, but even then it was really difficult to just put out a brief message in Russian. So I kind of had respect for him, at least from the point of view of being able to stand in front of the camera and give this polished speech in Russian if he didn't know it. But if he did know it, that would make more sense if he'd learned Russian. Yeah.
That's one thing I'll say for the governing body, that I don't think any of them now have ever been to college, but at least half of them, all the non-American guys, seem to speak several languages, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, it's commendable. You could say that there are different languages on the governing body. We've had Lösch speaking German, English, Romanian, and Italian. And if Sanderson does speak Russian, which it seems he does, you know, it's nice to know that there are different languages represented, even if there's a lack of diversity in other areas, shall we say. So that moves us on to David Splane. And now you're up, Phil.
Okay. And he's another one where there is a scanty information that's been published about him. But so we do know that he started pioneering in September of 1963. As far as I know, he is Canadian.
Do we know when he was born?
Well, so Bonnie Ziman, the therapist, she's Canadian, and she does have an interesting anecdote about David in her personal memoir that she wrote, Fading Out of the JW Cult. So she and her husband were special pioneers up there, but she mentions there was a convention in Toronto around 63, 64. And so she was working in one of the offices there, and David was one of the convention overseers. And she puts him at early 20s around 63. So I think he was about the same age as Gerrit Lösch, it sounds like, born in the early 40s.
That he's the only governing body member where we don't know even roughly what his birth year is.
Yeah.
Strong silent type, huh?
Yeah. Keeping it all secretive.
Indeed.
I'll lower my voice and let you in on the secret.
It's really funny to read Bonnie's, her memories of him, because she remembers that he was very kind of aloof, like he didn't really interact with the peons that were working in the convention department, and that if he ever smiled when he was talking to them, she said it was just his mouth would move, like his eyes didn't change. And she uses the word that he was a little creepy.
Yeah, that's very creepy. When your top face don't match your bottom face, that's the creepiest thing in the world.
The funny thing is, she says once in a while the head honchos would come around to the department there from Bethel and whatnot, and then he would like turn on the charm. He'd get super friendly, buddy with them. So she says even at that point, she kind of just had that vibe that he had ambitions to move up in the organization.
Interesting.
Oh, one other thing she mentions is that it was all the scuttlebutt in the department there that he was anointed at that point. And so all the sisters were talking about, whoa, what would it be like to date a young anointed guy, you know?
They really need to improve the things you need to do to be anointed. Like it shouldn't be that easy. Come on, man.
So he pioneered about 2 years, and then he went to Gilead in 1966. So he was actually the 42nd class. So he was one class behind Gerrit Lösch. I'll send you, there is a grainy picture of the graduating class in the Awake magazine. So
please. Yeah.
You can't see too much, but we can at least, because it mentions all their names, so we know that he was single at that point. He did later on. His wife's name is Linda, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So at Gilead that year, there's a funny little anecdote at the graduation. It says, at the graduation, one of the instructors alluded to the year 1975, the conclusion, chronologically speaking, of 6,000 years of human history. His question was, what will you be found doing when that time arrives? How satisfying it would be to have volunteered for Gilead training in the spirit of Isaiah, and to be then busied about taking the good news of the kingdom to far-off nations and peoples.
Interesting, yeah.
Boy, they was selling 1975 like it was diamonds and gold, man. Like, come on, get baptized. Come on, join our religion. This is 1975 is approaching quickly.
Well, in the September 2019 JW Broadcasting episode, obviously David Splane hosted that, and there's even a reenactment of him as a circuit overseer in Canada in the 1970s. Here's a few clips.
In the 1970s, my wife and I were in the circuit work in Montreal, Canada. Now, one Tuesday evening after the meeting, I was approached by a ministerial servant. He was very excited. He said, "David, I work with a man who is the head of a small church. He has invited me to his home." "That's nice," I said. He said, No, you don't understand. They never invite anyone to their home unless they're members of the church. I think this is going to be big. "Well," I said, "if he's interested, invite him to come to the meeting this weekend. I'd love to meet him." Now, here's what happened. The ministerial servant had been to the man's home, and he'd given a good witness. Then the brother met with the other responsible men of the church. They were interested in what the Bible says, and they wanted other members of the church to learn about the Bible too. So, about half the members of the church, around 1,000 people, accepted the invitation to have a Bible study. But what moved the leader of the church to invite the brother to his home in the first place? Watch the following video, and I'll answer that question at the end.
In the mid-1970s, several brothers from the Montreal area were approached to help with a unique situation that was unfolding. A special pioneer who was taking the lead at the time said that about 1,000 people all from the same church, wanted to study the Bible with Jehovah's Witnesses. And it was all because of an informal witness.
At that time, when it refers to people coming into the organization, it's because of that prediction, and yet he isn't honest enough to mention in that broadcasting episode that that's why people were joining.
Yeah, I would have left that out too.
Yeah.
Would not brought that thing up. We try to leave false prophecies out of our,
It wasn't the organization's proudest moment, although obviously they had recently the convention material suggesting that it was all the fault of the brothers at the time for running ahead of the organization. For taking things too seriously. That's what it amounted to.
Yeah, which is so ridiculous, because even just looking at the 8 guys on the governing body, you can see that 75 was a real pivot point in their lives.
Indeed.
They definitely have a position to whereas whenever there's an opportunity to accept responsibility, they never do it. They always shift the blame. I'm still waiting on them to make an apology. They're one of the few large organizations who just refuse to make any apologies. They'll make you apologize for them way before they make any apologies themselves.
So when 1975 hit, Tony Morris initially came off pioneering, but then later and started a family, etc. What impact did 1975 have on Splane?
Let's see. Well, that was just the main thing, just that the talk at his graduation.
Okay. So he's gung-ho all the way, and he doesn't drop off or anything. He keeps going at it.
Right. I think the other ones are Steve Letts, how his parents kind of quit pioneering after 75.
Yeah.
And then Mark Sanderson getting baptized as a 9-year-old in early 75. I can't help but wonder if that had something to do with it. But yeah, at any rate, after Gilead, the class that year had 3 language classes, French, Spanish, and Japanese. So Dave was in the French one, and he was sent to Senegal in West Africa, which is a largely French-speaking country. He was a missionary there it seems like only about 4 years. And then so I don't know if he had health problems or what, but he ended up coming back to Canada. And then he was a circuit overseer there, like you said, for about 19 years until 1990.
Can he speak French, do we know?
He can.
He can.
Yes.
So there's another language on the governing body. Yeah.
Yeah, French. And actually in 2010, he was down in Chile giving a branch dedication talk, and it says that he gave the talk in Spanish down there. So.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
It's
multilingual again.
Indeed. So
and that's another feather in the cap for being appointed to the governing body. Have you served in the service department, and do you speak at least another language?
Yeah, and I would guess because it seems like from what I've read that his circuits were mainly in Eastern Canada, and that's where Quebec is, which is French speaking, and so I assume he was serving French circuits during his time up there. I don't know if I was kind of curious if he ever crossed paths with Mark Sanderson while he was in Canada, but so I don't know about that.
But if I know David Splane, because the way he describes himself in that dramatization I've just played is as kind of quite aloof. And, when he hears of someone who might be interested, he's like, well, they should come to the Kingdom Hall then. So I can only imagine if he were to encounter this kind of young, ambitious Mark Sanderson talking about his Watchtower collection, he'd be like, oh, yeah, come on, move along.
For sure. So after their time in the circuit work, he's married by this point. In 1990, they were transferred to the American Bethel. And he spent about 8 years. Now, he mixed it up. He was in the service department, but he was also in the writing department there. He was in
the service department and the writing department.
Yeah, I don't know if it was simultaneously or one after.
No, it wouldn't have been. But we still have another governing body member who worked in the service department. You know,
So
come
are
on.
we now 8 for 8 with the governing body members in the service department? That
I'm
makes
sure
it
there's
8
at
for 8,
least
right?
one that wasn't in the service department. Was there?
Yeah, depending what Gerrit Lösch meant by the executive.
Yeah, it's
there.
unclear with Gerrit Lösch.
See, that's old school service department. That's all it is. It's just old service department before it was named the service department.
Yeah, I'm trying to look back on my notes for Gerrit Lösch. Right, so he was a helper to the service committee, Gerrit Lösch. He wasn't necessarily, we don't know whether he was on the service department, but the service committee has oversight of the service department. So, yeah.
Gotcha. In my book, that's service department.
So, yeah, and after that, in 98, he became a helper to the writing committee of the governing body. And then in 99, he was appointed along, and he was in that class with Sam Hurd, Steve Lett, and Guy Pearce.
Oh, yeah, he was appointed. They were all appointed at the same time, weren't they? Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. And is that pretty much his story?
Pretty much. The only other thing I saw was that he seems to have kind of like a little musical connection, because in 2009.
Oh, that's right. He likes, when they have the Bethel choir, and he likes to be the one that does the orchestrating at the front. He likes to point to people. Yeah, you sing now. Let's hear more of your. Oh no, let's just change the way you sing. Yeah, that's right. And he likes to do all that jazz, doesn't he, at the front of the choir?
Oh, he's so repressed. He wanted to be a musical instructor so bad.
You see, it would have, in terms of optics, in terms of PR, it would have actually looked better for him to actually be in the choir taking instructions off someone else, wouldn't it? But that's not the way the mind of a governing body member works. No, I want to be the one who's orchestrating. And, yeah.
Yeah,
but he is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I always think of him as like the Bond villain on the governing body. You know, if there's one who looks to me to be quite cold and calculated, I mean, you have Tony Morris and Stephen Lett, who are kind of like clowns, basically. But David Splane seems to be the one out of all of them who is really, he exudes arrogance, to me at least. He exudes self-importance, the way he patronizes, the way he talks down. I'll lower my voice.
Would you like to know the theme for the 2020 convention program? I'll lower my voice, and I'll let you in on it.
He clearly thinks very highly of himself, and he just seems to be more reserved. I just find him to be, out of all of them, the one who seems the most narcissistic. So it's ironic that we know so little about him. Surely his life story will come out at some point, but he's clearly not jumping through hoops to make that happen, is he? Given how long he's been on the governing body.
For somebody to be in that high of a position and to have that little information about them released, that's done purposefully. You know, that's not an accident. And for him to be as narcissistic as he is, I don't know if he, we really want to get that information. It's probably some crazy stuff in there.
Yeah.
I would love to hear his story, though. But
I can imagine he's done stuff that he really isn't or shouldn't be proud of. I'm just remembering as well that time when on JW Broadcasting, he questioned the official age of the Sphinx.
According to the Smithsonian Knowledge Encyclopedia, the Egyptian Sphinx was constructed around 2550 BCE. The Egyptian Sphinx was constructed around 2550 BCE. Well, the problem is with the date, 2550. The global flood occurred about 200 years after that date. So what are the chances that the Sphinx survived the flood? Unless, of course, you think that that's how the Sphinx lost his nose.
This guy, man, if it doesn't meet the time schedule they came up with,
yeah,
it's like, oh no, the Earth is only a couple thousand years old. Come on now, the Sphinx can't be that old. I mean, yeah, these guys are very, very narcissistic.
We know better than historians and archaeologists, and probably the most the most famous appearance on JW Broadcasting for me was clearly his explanation of overlapping generations.
Would you like an easy way to keep the generations straight? An easy way is to consider the situation of Brother Fred W. Franz. Now, you'll see that he's FWF on the chart. Now, as we said before, Brother Franz was born in 1893. He was baptized in November of 1913. So, as one of the Lord's anointed in 1914, he saw the sign and he understood what the sign meant. Now, Brother Franz lived a long life. He finished his earthly course at 99 years of age in 1992. Now, do you know of many who were of the anointed in 1914 and who outlived Brother Franz? There may have been some, but not many. Now, just for the sake of argument, suppose that we assume that Brother Franz was the last of that first group of anointed ones. That is, the group of anointed ones who were anointed in 1914, who saw the sign, and then continued serving faithfully. Now, we're not saying Brother Franz was. We just don't know. But for the sake of argument, let's suppose. In order to be part of this generation, someone would have had to have been anointed before 1992, because he would have to have been a contemporary of some of the first group.
He really jumped into it with both feet there, didn't he?
That's a future classic right there.
Absolutely. I'll get my whiteboard out and show you how it's possible for one generation to actually be two generations. So, yeah, incredible.
And he really tried to explain that. Like, he had the lines and, okay, so the generation stops here and then another generation comes. I was like, wow, you really took some cojones to actually stand up and try to put that out to intelligent people.
We're not saying it all revolves around Freddie Franz, but kind of all revolves around Freddie Franz, yeah. So that was quite astonishing. But that brings us, gentlemen, to all 8 members of the governing body. We've managed to get through it in 2 videos, and we should pat ourselves on the back, quite frankly.
I have no problem patting myself on the back. High five.
Hopefully at least 10% of our material has been correct. If not, it's been 100% misleading.
How does that work? What if 90% of our material is correct? Does that mean we're only like 1% misleading, like, or 10% misleading? How does that work?
Who knows? But seriously, chaps, I really appreciate you taking the time to go through this material with me. Hopefully we've created at least the start of a conversation on, you know, the particulars of these men who make incredible claims about themselves. Let's not forget, we're not being, I don't feel at least, overly invasive by asking about the credentials of these men and the background, given the fact that they literally claim to be a conduit with the Almighty. They claim to collectively be the channel of communication between God and mankind. It's right to ask, as far as I'm concerned, what are these men like? What will God, if he's chosen them, what information will he be looking at in their life that makes them so special that they get to form a group of 8 people who are disseminating information from on high to mankind? So I feel it's justified that we look into their lives in this much detail. If you want to look into their lives in even more detail, please go check out Phil's Blue Envelope channel, where he is going through them one by one and already has a number of videos. And Phil, I understand, as you said in the last video, that you have more to come.
Yes. I'm sure there's always a little more tidbits to find out about these fellows.
And sometimes, of course, you'll get new light on previous information. So you'll do corrections to previous videos, perhaps.
That sounds good to me, yeah.
I'm sure there's no shortage of material to be working with. And you do videos on other subjects as well. So check out Phil's channel, Blue Envelope. Jay now has 2 channels for you to check out.
Yes,
Is that right, Jay?
I have officially started my purely comedy channel called Jay's Comedy Corner. And yeah, if you want to see me act a fool on there, that's why I'll be doing that. But my Jay the Comedian channel is where I do, you know, my basic dive into like the Jehovah Witness organization, and I give my comedic take on it for the most part. Thanks,
okay.
Thanks, Lloyd. Appreciate it.
Look, you've appeared on my channel enough. I would be remiss not to point people to your online presence. So please keep the amazing work on there, and viewers, do check out what Jay's been doing. But again, thank you so much, guys, for joining me and going through this information with me.
Thank you for having us. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's good times.
So viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this information. Don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.